Selene Vega had never imagined she would end up here, strapped to the cold, gleaming hull of a warship, a living trophy for the entire galaxy to see. The Drakari Empire had swept through Earth like a thunderstorm, and Selene had been one of the unlucky few caught in the chaos. She was a soldier, tough, resilient, and always ready for a fight. But this was something different. As the Drakari warship Conqueror soared through the dark expanse of space, Selene hung from its metal exterior, her hands shackled and her body displayed like a relic from a forgotten age. Her once vibrant brown hair, now matted with sweat and blood, fluttered weakly in the zero-gravity environment. Her face, though bruised and battered, still radiated a fierce, unyielding defiance. The Drakari might have captured her, but they would never break her spirit. Her eyes, full of fire, glared down at the endless stretch of stars below, her mind constantly racing for a way out. Jarek, the commander of the Drakari warship, stood on the bridge, looking out at Selene's display. He was a massive figure, his scales glistening like obsidian armor. The Drakari were a fearsome race, tall, muscular, with skin that looked like it could withstand any weapon. Jarek's eyes, burning with pride, watched as other ships and travelers passed by. Noticing the human hanging on his ship was a symbol of his victory, of the Drakari's superiority. His kind had crushed countless species, and now, a human, one of the toughest species in the galaxy, was a part of his collection. To him, Selene was more than just a prisoner. She was proof that the Drakari Empire was unstoppable, that even the human race, known for their resistance, could be broken. But Selene refused to let him win. Every day, she felt the weight of her captivity, the sharp edges of the chains cutting into her wrists, the harsh rays of distant stars burning her skin. But in her heart, a fire still blazed. She remembered the days before, the camaraderie with her fellow soldiers, the sense of unity that Earth had fought for. She remembered the lessons her father taught her, to never give up, to never back down. It was hard to hold on to that now, in the face of overwhelming power, but she would. She had to. For Earth, for everyone who believed in freedom. As days turned into weeks, the ship continued its journey, traveling deeper into the heart of Drakari space. Selene's body grew weaker, her energy sapped by the constant exposure to the elements. But her mind remained sharp. She had survived worse in her time as a soldier. The memory of her comrades, the training they had all undergone, fueled her resolve. She wouldn't be another trophy to hang on some Drakari wall. She wouldn't let Jarek have the satisfaction of breaking her. From time to time, Selene would catch glimpses of the crew members passing by, some of them eyeing her with pity, some with amusement, but most with indifference. They didn't understand. They couldn't. To them, she was just another prize. But for her, this was far from over. The thought of giving up never crossed her mind. She was stronger than that. And though the universe seemed vast and empty, filled with endless stars and unknown dangers, one thing was certain. Selene Vega would find a way to escape. No matter what it took, she would break free of this hellish prison. In the cold vastness of space, one human stood as a living testament to resistance. It was a symbol not just for the Drakari, but for every species oppressed by their empire. And Selene Vega, defiant and unbroken, would be their spark. Commander Jarek stood tall on the bridge of the Conqueror, his glowing eyes fixed on the image of Selene Vega, the human prisoner strapped to the hull of his warship. He was a towering figure, his body covered in thick, dark scales that shimmered under the ship's artificial lights, and his sharp claws clacked against the metal as he paced. The Drakari were a fearsome race, with an imposing presence that struck fear into the hearts of their enemies. They were natural-born conquerors, their empire spreading like wildfire across the galaxy. Jarek, a master tactician and ruthless warrior, had risen to the top of his people through sheer strength and cunning. But more than that, he had a hunger for victory, for power. When he had first captured Selene, he had been amused by her resilience, her spirit. The humans were known for their defiance, for their ability to resist even the most overwhelming odds. But Jarek knew that all things could be broken. And Celine, this human warrior, would be no different. She would serve as a powerful symbol, a reminder to the galaxy that no one could stand against the might of the Drakari Empire. The humans had put up a fight, but in the end, they had fallen just like every other species before them. Jarek believed that displaying Celine as his trophy would be a lasting blow to the morale of the humans. They would see their finest warrior hung on the ship's hull for all to witness and know that their resistance was futile. Jarek turned his gaze away from the window and toward his second-in-command, a sharp-eyed Drakari named Voker. "Her spirit will break," he muttered, his voice low and confident. "No human can endure this. Soon, she will beg for mercy." Voker, ever the loyal servant, nodded in agreement. "Yes, Commander. She will crumble before your power. There is no escape from the might of the Drakari." Jarek smiled darkly. He had never failed, and he didn't intend to start now. For weeks, Celine had been a constant reminder of the human stubbornness, their refusal to accept their fate. But every time he saw her, still alive, still defiant, his anger only grew. How could a creature so small, so fragile, continue to hold on to her defiance? It made no sense to him. But Jarek understood something about power that others didn't. Power wasn't just about strength, it was about control. And the longer Celine resisted, the more control he had over her. As the Conqueror sped through the stars, Jarek's thoughts turned to the future. He was preparing for a new phase of the Drakari Empire's expansion, one that would see the fall of more worlds, the crushing of more enemies. The humans were just one step in his greater plan. He would show them the futility of their resistance, and once they saw their finest warriors broken, they would submit. The ship's engines hummed softly as it glided through the vastness of space. Jarek's thoughts turned back to Celine, who was still out there, hanging in the void. He would let her hang there for a while longer just to see if she would finally crack. Perhaps the cold emptiness of space would take her resolve. Perhaps the isolation, the endless silence, would break her. Every passing moment was a victory in itself, and Jarek knew that when she finally broke, when she finally bent to his will, she would serve him, as every other conquered species had before. He turned to Voker again. "Prepare for our next conquest. The humans may be stubborn, but they will learn their place." His voice was filled with an icy certainty. Voker saluted and left to carry out the orders, leaving Jarek to watch the stars once more. His mind raced with visions of a galaxy under the Drakari's rule, where nothing and no one could challenge their supremacy. And Celine Vega, she would be nothing more than a forgotten relic, her spirit erased by the might of the Drakari. But as Jarek's mind wandered, he could not shake the nagging thought that Celine might not be as broken as he believed. But for now, he would savor his victory. No human, no matter how fierce, could stop the Drakari Empire. Far from the oppressive grip of the Drakari Empire, deep in the forgotten corners of space, a different story was unfolding. Captain Jax Calloway, a former soldier of Earth, sat hunched over the control panel of his battered ship, the Resolute, as it drifted through the dark void. His dark brown hair was unkempt, a reflection of the disarray in his life since the fall of Earth. He wasn't a hero by choice. He was a man shaped by regret, by mistakes that had left deep scars on his soul. Once, he had been part of the Earth's military, a leader among his people, but now, after the invasion and the planet's fall, he was a rogue, a soldier with no home to return to. His only purpose was survival, and for years he had lived in the shadows, avoiding any confrontation with the Drakari or other galactic forces. But when Jax had learned about Celine Vega, something in him shifted. The message had come through a secure channel, an encrypted transmission sent from a former comrade who had narrowly escaped the Drakari's wrath. It was a report of a human warrior, a symbol of resistance, who had been taken alive and displayed as a trophy on the Drakari warship Conqueror. The name Celine Vega struck a chord deep within Jax. He had heard of her, of her bravery, her reputation as one of the most skilled and determined soldiers Earth had ever produced. To Jax, she wasn't just another prisoner. She was a sign of hope, a chance, no matter how slim, to strike back at the Drakari. Jax's grip tightened around the controls, and his eyes narrowed in determination. He had spent years running, staying under the radar, but he couldn't ignore the call of something greater now. He knew that if he didn't act, Celine, the last spark of humanity's defiance, would be snuffed out. He couldn't let that happen. Not when there was a chance to fight back. It wasn't just about rescuing one soldier. It was about reigniting the fire of resistance in the hearts of all humans. His ship wasn't much to look at. The Resolute had seen better days. The hull was scratched and scorched from numerous close calls, and the interior was cramped with equipment and supplies. But it was fast, and that was all Jax needed. His crew, a small group of trusted fighters, shared his determination. They had been through countless battles together, and though they had lost much, they still believed in something worth fighting for. "Jax," said a voice from behind, breaking his concentration. It was Tessa, his second-in-command, a fiery woman with short black hair and piercing green eyes. She was tough, but her loyalty to Jax was what made her invaluable. "We've got a lead on the Conqueror. It's heading toward Drakari space. If we move now, we can intercept them before they get too far." Jax nodded, his face hardening with resolve. "Set course for the Drakari border. We don't have much time." Tessa hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "You're sure about this? We know what the Drakari are capable of. This is dangerous." "I know," Jax said quietly, his voice filled with certainty. "But if we don't do this, if we don't try, then what was the point of everything we fought for? The Drakari can't win. Not this time. Not while we have people like Celine fighting for us." Tessa studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded. "All right, Captain. We're with you." With the crew rallying behind him, Jax made his decision. There was no turning back. They would face the Drakari. They would face certain death. But they would not go quietly. They would fight, and they would do whatever it took to bring Celine home. It wasn't just about one soldier. It was about reclaiming their dignity, their pride, and their future. As the stars streaked by, and the Resolute surged toward its destination, Jax found a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. For the first time since Earth's fall, he wasn't running. He was fighting. And this fight, he promised himself, would not be lost. Not while there was still hope. The Conqueror loomed large in the distance, a dark monolith of destruction drifting through the stars. As Jax Calloway and his crew approached, the tension aboard the Resolute was thick enough to cut through. Jax gripped the controls, his eyes scanning the vast expanse of space ahead. Tessa, his second-in-command, stood by his side, her fingers dancing across the console, plotting their stealth approach. They knew that if they were detected too soon, the Drakari would turn their warship into a trap, and all hope would be lost. "All systems green, Captain," Tessa reported, her voice calm but betraying the edge of anxiety she felt. "We're on course. The Drakari haven't detected us yet." Jax nodded but didn't relax. The Conqueror was a fortress in space, its weaponry and defenses unmatched. Every minute they spent inside Drakari space increased the risk of detection. The plan was simple: infiltrate the warship undetected, rescue Celine Vega, and escape before the Drakari even realized what had happened. It was a long shot, but it was their only shot. "All right," Jax said, looking at his crew, a group of battle-hardened veterans who had all lost something in the fight against the Drakari. "Stay sharp. We're not just rescuing one person. We're sending a message. We fight back. We don't run. We never give up." The crew exchanged determined nods. They knew the risks, but they also knew the stakes. This wasn't just a rescue mission. It was a chance to strike a blow against the empire that had shattered their world. As the Resolute edged closer to the warship, Jax ordered the crew to board the Drakari vessel. Using a series of old military codes and expert piloting, they managed to slip through the Drakari's outer defenses, hiding in the shadow of the massive warship. Once inside, they quickly boarded through a hidden airlock, their hearts racing with the adrenaline of what they were about to attempt. The air was cold and metallic inside the Conqueror, and the hum of the ship's engines vibrated through the walls. It was a strange mix of awe and fear that filled Jax as he led his crew through the maze-like hallways of the warship. The Drakari weren't known for their hospitality, and every step felt like they were walking through enemy territory. The hallways were dimly lit, adorned with alien technology, and the smell of the ship, something like sulfur and oil, clung to the air. Jax kept his hand on his weapon, his eyes scanning every corner. He had been in many dangerous situations, but this felt different. This was the heart of Drakari power. It was their fortress. As they made their way deeper into the ship, they passed signs of the Drakari's brutal rule. Alien skulls lined the walls in grotesque displays, trophies from their conquests across the galaxy. Jax's stomach twisted at the sight, but there was no time to stop. They had one mission: find Celine and get her out of there. Jax's team moved silently, blending into the shadows. They used the Drakari's own tactics against them, hiding from patrols, slipping past guard stations, and disabling security systems whenever possible. Every step was calculated, every movement deliberate. They were well trained, but the longer they spent on the Conqueror, the more they realized just how far they were from safety. The ship was a behemoth, and the Drakari were ruthless in their vigilance. It wasn't until they reached the lower levels of the ship that they finally saw her. Celine Vega, the woman who had become a symbol of resistance, hung from the hull of the warship, her body barely recognizable after days of exposure. Jax's heart pounded in his chest as he saw her, chained and bloodied, but still alive. Her eyes, though weak, burned with defiance, just as he had heard. She had refused to break, even when the Drakari thought they had broken her. "Celine," Jax whispered, his voice filled with a mix of awe and disbelief. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold metal as he approached her. Celine's eyes flickered toward him, recognition flashing in her gaze. She didn't say anything at first, but the slight nod she gave him was enough. She was ready to fight, even in the face of unimaginable pain. Jax didn't hesitate. He motioned for his crew to prepare the tools to free her, his mind already racing with the next step. The Drakari would soon notice the disturbance. They had to move fast. The fight for Celine's freedom had just begun, and there was no turning back. The tension in the air was palpable. Jax Calloway and his crew had managed to locate Celine Vega, but their mission was far from over. As they worked quickly to free her from the chains binding her to the cold hull of the Conqueror, every second felt like an eternity. The warship's corridors were eerily silent, but Jax knew it wouldn't last. The Drakari were a ruthless and vigilant race. They would discover the breach soon, and when they did, they wouldn't hesitate to hunt them down. "Almost there," Tessa whispered, her voice barely audible as she used a plasma cutter to free Celine's shackles. The crew worked as quietly as possible, their every move calculated, their nerves steeled for what was to come. Celine's eyes never left Jax as she slowly regained her strength, her face pale but determined. She looked like a warrior, even in her weakened state, her defiance still burning in her gaze. She had endured unimaginable pain, and yet her will remained unbroken. Jax had heard stories of her bravery, but seeing it firsthand made him respect her even more. The plasma cutter hissed, and the last of the chains fell away. Celine staggered for a moment but steadied herself. Jax reached out, offering his hand, which she took with a firm grip. "Thank you," she rasped, her voice hoarse but steady. "You didn't have to come for me." "We couldn't leave you here," Jax replied, his voice low but filled with conviction. "You're not just a symbol of resistance. You're the chance we have to fight back." Celine nodded, her eyes scanning the corridor, her mind already shifting to the next phase of their escape. We need to move fast. The Drakari will notice we're gone soon. We can't afford to be caught. Agreed, Jack said. He motioned for his crew to fall into formation, and they began to make their way back toward the ship's airlock. But as they moved, the faint sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Jax's heart raced. They were already too late to avoid detection. "Ambush!" shouted Tessa, her eyes widening in alarm as she reached for her weapon. The crew dropped into defensive positions, pulling out blasters and energy rifles as the Drakari guards appeared at the end of the hallway. The towering aliens, with their sleek black armor and glowing red eyes, advanced quickly, their weapons raised. Jax cursed under his breath. There was no time for a firefight. "Split up," Jax shouted, his voice commanding. "Head for the airlock. We'll cover you." The crew scattered in different directions, but the Drakari soldiers were quick to react. Energy blasts flew past them, narrowly missing their targets. The sound of gunfire filled the hallway as Jax and Tessa fired back, their shots striking the Drakari's armor, but failing to do much damage. The Drakari were built for battle, and their armor was nearly indestructible. But it wasn't invincible. Jax knew he needed to buy them enough time to escape, even if it meant putting himself at risk. He turned to Celine, who was already moving with incredible speed, her body seeming to forget the exhaustion that had plagued her moments before. She was a warrior in every sense of the word, and despite the odds, she wasn't about to let anything stop her. "We're almost there," Jax yelled as they ran toward the airlock. But just as they reached the door, a Drakari officer appeared, blocking their escape. The officer was taller than the others, with a jagged scar running down his face. His eyes were filled with anger, and in his hands, he gripped a long, sharp blade, ready for the fight. "Not so fast," the officer growled, his voice guttural and full of malice. "You think you can escape so easily, human?" Jax's heart pounded in his chest. There was no time for a drawn-out battle. They had to move. Now. Before the officer could strike, Celine stepped forward, her eyes narrowing with lethal precision. Without a word, she launched herself at the Drakari officer, her movements swift and graceful, like a predator closing in on its prey. The officer swung his blade at her, but Celine was too fast, dodging with expert skill and landing a solid punch to his midsection. The officer staggered, stunned, but Celine didn't give him a chance to recover. She disarmed him in an instant, knocking the blade from his hand with a swift kick. "Move," she ordered, her voice steady and commanding. Jax didn't need to be told twice. The airlock opened, and they rushed through it, leaving the Drakari officer and the sounds of battle behind them. They had made it, barely. As the airlock sealed, and the Resolute pulled away from the Conqueror, Jax looked out into the vastness of space, his breath coming in heavy gasps. They had done it. They had freed Celine. But their fight was far from over. The Drakari would come after them, and this was just the beginning of their war. But in that moment, Jax couldn't help but feel a spark of hope. They were still alive, and that meant they could keep fighting. The stars seemed brighter as the Resolute drifted farther from the Drakari warship, the Conqueror, now a fading shadow in the distance. Jax Calloway sat at the helm, his hands steady on the controls but his mind still racing. They had managed to escape the Drakari's grasp, but the battle was far from over. The Drakari would not let this humiliation slide. They would hunt them down with everything they had. "Captain, we've got a fleet of Drakari warships on our tail." Tessa's voice crackled through the comm system. "They've detected our escape. We won't be able to outrun them for long." Jax's jaw tightened. The fight had just begun. Their escape had been barely a victory, and now they were facing the full wrath of the Drakari Empire. He glanced over at Celine Vega, who had been quiet since their escape. Her face was hard, her eyes distant, but Jax could see the fire still burning in her. She had seen her world burn, watched as the Drakari tore through Earth and its colonies. She had fought in countless battles, and now, after everything she had been through, she was here, fighting again. "How long until we hit the Drakari border?" Jax asked, his voice steady. 30 minutes, maybe less, Tessa replied. Jax knew they needed to make a decision, and fast. They couldn't outrun the Drakari. Their only chance was to find a safe haven, a place where they could regroup, repair the ship, and plan their next move. But where? The galaxy was vast, but every corner of it seemed to be under the Drakari's control. Celine stood up from where she had been sitting, her posture straight despite the obvious toll her captivity had taken on her. She walked over to Jax, her voice calm but serious. "We need allies," she said simply. Jax looked at her, considering her words. "Allies? We've been running from the Drakari for years. Who's going to help us now?" "You'd be surprised," Celine replied with a faint smile. "There are still pockets of resistance out there. Not everyone is afraid of the Drakari. We just need to know where to look." Jax raised an eyebrow. "And how exactly are we supposed to find them?" Celine's gaze sharpened. "I know of a few places, a few factions that might be willing to help, but we'll have to move fast. The Drakari won't give up the chase easily." Jax felt the weight of her words. They had been alone for so long, isolated from the rest of the galaxy, but now, with Celine's knowledge and connections, they had a chance to turn the tide. If they could find these factions, perhaps they could build an army, or at the very least, secure a safe haven. The Drakari weren't invincible. They had weaknesses, and Jax was certain that with the right support, they could exploit those weaknesses. "We don't have time to waste," Jax said. "Set a course for the closest faction you can reach." Tessa nodded, already adjusting the ship's coordinates. "Course set. We should be there in less than 20 minutes." As the Resolute changed course, Jax looked at Celine once more. "You think this will work? These factions, they can really help us." Celine's eyes were fierce, unwavering. "I don't know if they'll help us, but they'll want to. The Drakari have been expanding for too long. They've made too many enemies. And people like us. People who have lost everything. We'll fight back. Together." Jax believed her. For the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope. The weight of the galaxy seemed to lift, even if just for a moment. As the stars stretched out in front of them, the crew braced themselves for the next part of their journey. They had rescued Celine. They had escaped the Drakari. But the hardest part was yet to come, uniting the scattered forces of resistance and fighting to take back their galaxy. The stakes had never been higher. But Jax knew one thing for sure: he wasn't fighting alone anymore. And with Celine by his side, they might just have a chance. The Resolute tore through the empty expanse of space, the hum of its engines a steady rhythm that kept the crew focused on their mission. Jax Calloway sat at the helm, his knuckles white from gripping the controls. His mind was on the task ahead, finding the hidden resistance base that Celine had spoken of. Time was running out. The Drakari were relentless, and they knew that every minute they spent in open space brought them closer to being caught. Tessa, who stood by Jax's side, kept her eyes glued to the radar. No signs of Drakari ships yet. But we can't keep running forever. We need to find this base, and fast. "I know," Jax replied, his voice steady despite the anxiety gnawing at him. "We don't have much longer before they pick up our trail again." "Celine, are you sure this place is still operational?" Celine Vega, who had been quiet for the last few hours, finally spoke up. "It's not a matter of if it's operational. It's a matter of whether they trust us. We're not the first ones to show up looking for help. They've been burned before, so we need to prove that we're serious." Her eyes met Jax's, a flicker of uncertainty flashing across her face. "But if we can find them, they'll help. They have to." Jax nodded, but his mind was racing. He couldn't afford to let doubt creep in. They had come too far, risked too much, to fail now. But he understood the gravity of the situation. The resistance wasn't just about surviving. It was about taking a stand. And he knew better than anyone that people were often hesitant to risk their lives on a cause that had been beaten down so many times before. Minutes passed in tense silence as the ship sped through the cold, empty void. Finally, Tessa spoke again, her voice calm but with a note of urgency. "Captain, we're approaching the coordinates. Getting a signal, but it's faint. I'm not sure if they'll respond to us." "Keep trying," Jax ordered, gripping the edge of his seat. "We're not turning back." Tessa's fingers flew over the console as she adjusted the ship's communication systems. Static filled the air, followed by the crackling sound of a voice that barely came through the static. "Unidentified vessel, state your intentions. You have 5 seconds to respond." Celine's gaze flickered toward Jax. Her voice was low, but steady. "It's them. They're cautious, but they'll listen. Tell them we're here to offer help. We need a place to regroup," Jax said, his tone firm. "We're running from the Drakari, and we have a warrior who fought against them with us." Tessa relayed the message, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then the voice crackled back to life. "Confirmed. You're clear to dock. Prepare for landing." The tension in the air didn't lift, but a glimmer of hope shone in Jax's chest. They had made it. They had found the hidden base, and they had a chance. But the moment wasn't over yet. They had to prove their worth. As the Resolute slowly docked at the hidden base, Jax couldn't help but feel a mix of awe and disbelief. The base was located on an asteroid, tucked away in a remote corner of the galaxy. From the outside, it looked like any other rock floating in space, but as the ship's landing gear touched down and the doors opened, Jax saw something he hadn't seen in a long time. Life. The base was bustling with activity. Resistance fighters, some human, some alien, moved about, preparing for something. It was a small base, but it was alive with purpose. It was a far cry from the grim silence of the last few years, when the fight against the Drakari seemed like a lost cause. Jax and Celine led the way as the crew stepped out of the ship. A group of armed guards met them, their faces wary but not hostile. They were obviously on edge, but there was a sense of readiness in their eyes. "Who are you?" one of the guards asked, his voice rough but not unkind. "And why should we trust you?" "We're the ones who fought to free Celine Vega," Jax replied, stepping forward with confidence. "We need your help. The Drakari are coming after us, and we can't keep running. We need to stand together, or we'll fall apart." The guard studied Jax for a moment, then looked to his companions. A silent conversation passed between them, and after a long pause, the leader of the group gave a short nod. "All right," he said, lowering his weapon. "You're in, but you'd better be ready to fight." Jax exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment sinking in. They had made it. Barely. They had found a place where they could regroup, heal, and plan their next move. It wasn't much, but it was something. And something was all they needed to start a rebellion. As the crew was led deeper into the base, Jax glanced at Celine, her eyes meeting his. There was no turning back now. They had found the resistance, and together, they would fight to take back their galaxy. The days spent at the hidden resistance base were a blur of training, strategy sessions, and relentless preparations. Jax Calloway barely had time to rest, constantly meeting with Celine Vega and the resistance leaders to plan their next moves. The Drakari were relentless, and every moment they waited meant the enemy was drawing closer. Celine had proven to be a strong leader, her knowledge of the Drakari tactics invaluable to the resistance fighters. She had fought alongside the best, and her experience was their guide through the maze of war. With her at the helm, the morale of the troops seemed to surge. There was hope now, something that had been missing for far too long. But hope alone wasn't enough. They needed more. Jax knew this, and he felt the pressure mounting every day as their small, ragtag group prepared to face an enemy far superior in number and firepower. The resistance fighters were brave, but they lacked the equipment and resources to match the Drakari's might. Their success would depend on strategy, timing, and a little bit of luck. Jack stood at the edge of the training area, watching the soldiers spar in mock combat. The sounds of blasters and the clang of weapons echoed around him. He admired the determination in the fighters' eyes, but he also knew that it wasn't enough to hope for victory. They needed to be ready. "Captain," Tessa called from behind him. "We've got reports. The Dracari have begun their sweep of the sector. They're coming for us." Jax's stomach tightened. He had known this day would come, but hearing it out loud still made his heart race. How soon? Less than 20 hours. They've got a fleet headed our way. But it's not just about their numbers. They've got a new weapon, something they've been testing on smaller colonies. Jax turned to her, his brows furrowing. "A new weapon." Tessa nodded grimly. "We don't know the specifics, but it's powerful. Whatever it is, it's enough to wipe out anything in its path." Jax knew they had to move fast. They couldn't afford to wait around while the Dracari tested their new weapon. "What's our plan?" Celine approached, her expression focused. "We'll hit them first. We got to take out their weapons before they can use them. If we can sabotage their fleet, we'll buy ourselves some time." Jax glanced at her, impressed by her resolve. "You think we can pull it off? They're no pushovers." "I know," she replied. "But we have something they don't. Unity. We fought for years alone, and now we have a chance to strike back together. We can do this." Jax nodded, feeling a surge of confidence. She was right. They had the advantage of surprise and a fierce determination to protect their people. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "We'll need to move quickly," Jax said. "Tessa, get the fleet ready. We'll strike at the Dracari fleet tonight. We've got one shot at this." Tessa saluted, then hurried off to gather the other leaders. Jax and Celine stood together, looking out at the resistance fighters training. Jax knew this was the moment that would define their future. Victory was uncertain, but they had no choice but to try. The night before the battle, the base was alive with activity. Fighters loaded up on weapons, supplies, and anything else they might need for the assault. Jax stood in the command center, going over the final plans with his team. It was a dangerous mission, but it was the only one that had a chance of succeeding. Celine came to him, her eyes steady. "You know this won't be easy. We might lose some of them." Jax turned to her, his expression hard. "I know, but we have to try. If we don't take this chance, we're as good as dead." Celine placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll get through it. We have to." Jax looked around at the fighters, the brave souls willing to risk everything for a chance at freedom. He had never seen anything like it before, people who had lost everything, yet still had the strength to fight. "We fight together," Jax said, his voice full of resolve. "Tomorrow, we make our stand." The next day, as the first rays of light glinted off the hull of the Resolute, Jax and his crew boarded the ship. The fighters were ready. The resistance was ready. The battle for their galaxy was about to begin. As they launched into space, the weight of the coming conflict hung over them, but so did the hope of victory. They had a chance, and no matter the outcome, they would go down fighting. "Let's show the Dracari what humanity is made of," Jax said to his crew, his voice steady, but filled with purpose. Together, they moved forward into the unknown, ready for the battle that would define the future of their galaxy. The fleet of resistance ships flew in perfect formation, the dark expanse of space stretching endlessly before them. Jax Calloway's heart raced as the Resolute surged forward, its engines roaring through the silent void. The mission was simple: strike at the heart of the Dracari fleet and disable their new weapon before it could be unleashed. But nothing in this war was ever simple. The odds were stacked against them, and failure meant the end of everything. Celine Vega stood beside him, her gaze locked on the holographic display showing the Dracari fleet. The ships were massive, their dark, jagged shapes like sharks patrolling the blackness. They had been expecting the Dracari to respond quickly, but seeing them in person was something else. The sheer size and power of the enemy force sent a chill down Jax's spine, but he pushed the fear aside. They had come too far to turn back now. "We've got one chance," Jax said, his voice steady but urgent. "We hit their main command ship first. That's where the new weapon is." Celine nodded, her expression unreadable. "We can't afford to miss. If we do, everything we fought for will be lost." Jax clenched his fists. He knew the stakes. They couldn't allow the Drakari to complete their weapon. They had no idea how it worked, but one thing was certain. It could destroy entire planets. The Drakari were cruel, and they had already wiped out countless colonies. This weapon was their final trump card, and if it wasn't stopped, the war would be over before it even began. "We've got this," Tessa's voice came through the comms, cutting through Jax's thoughts. "We're ready to engage. All fighters are in position." Jax exhaled, his nerves sharpening into focus. "All right, everyone, stay sharp. We move in on my command." The fleet advanced, the Resolute leading the charge, its weapons primed and ready. The Drakari ships turned to face them. There, a fierce battle was about to begin, and Jax knew there was no turning back. "On my mark," Jax shouted. 3, 2, 1. He pressed the button, and all at once, the battle erupted. The first wave of enemy fire crashed against the shields of the Resolute, but the ship held strong. Jax's hands flew over the controls, guiding the ship through a barrage of blasts, weaving in and out of the enemy fire. The fighters swarmed around them, engaging the Drakari ships in dogfights, their laser cannons streaking through the black sky. Celine's voice came through the comms, calm but determined. "We're approaching the command ship. Prepare to board." Jax nodded, his heart hammering in his chest. This was it. He could see the massive Drakari vessel ahead, its weapons already firing on them. The Resolute dodged another blast, closing the distance between them and their target. "Lock onto their weak points," Jax ordered, his voice cool despite the chaos around them. "Fire everything we've got." The ship shook as their weapons slammed into the Drakari command ship. Explosions erupted on its hull, but it didn't slow down. The Drakari were relentless, but so were they. Jax's mind raced as he scanned for any. Then he saw it. A narrow opening near the command bridge. It was risky, but it was their best shot. "Target that opening," Jax commanded. The ship fired again, and this time, the blast hit the mark. The explosion tore through the command ship's shields, and the vessel rocked violently. Jax could see the opening now, clear and vulnerable. "Celine now," he shouted. With a practiced move, Celine grabbed the control lever, guiding the Resolute toward the opening. The ship ducked beneath a barrage of fire, diving straight into the breach. The resistance fighters followed, engaging the Drakari forces inside the ship. Jax and Celine led the charge, their hearts pounding with adrenaline as they stormed the command deck. The fight inside was brutal, but the resistance fighters fought with everything they had. Jax's blaster hummed as he fired at the Drakari soldiers, blocking their path. Celine was at his side, her blade flashing through the air, cutting down enemies with expert precision. It was a fast-paced battle. Each move, each decision could mean the difference between life and death. Finally, they reached the control room, and Jax slammed the door open, his blaster raised. The Drakari commander was waiting, surrounded by a squad of elite guards. Jax's eyes narrowed, but he didn't hesitate. "This ends now," he growled. A brutal firefight ensued, but the resistance fighters were too strong. With a final, well-placed shot, the Drakari commander fell, and the remaining soldiers scattered. Jax moved quickly to the control console, slamming his hand on the button that disabled the new weapon. Outside, the battle raged on, but with the weapon disabled, the tide of the war began to shift. The Drakari fleet faltered, their ships suddenly vulnerable to the Resistance's assault. Jax turned to Celine, a grim smile on his face.